Welcome back, everyone. This is the third episode of the Minecraft PC/Mac Edition Survival Series with Nick, the ElusiveEnderman. You're with our narrative version of the series, where we take a step back and look at how we can build a story around our Steve. A lot of current Minecraft talk-through videos describe what is going on, and if you want to see that version of this video, you can see the sidebar. There's a playlist to go through the talk-through version of the series. But if you want to hear a story instead, if you want this thing reported in a different style, stick with this narrative version. We'll be walking through the entire series with a little bit of a story. Steve got up in the morning and found himself in need of some resources. So he wandered his way down into the caves that adjoined his house and started to dig up pieces of coal. As he dug through them with his iron pickaxe, bits and pieces of colored wonder fell into his hands. He looked at them and knew that they represented the experience of mining. Over time, as his experience grew, he could transfer that experience onto other objects in his world. Those bits of experience could turn into things like more advanced weaponry, or books that did great things for other objects. Steve, as long as he could remember, had lived in a world that was defined by blocks. It was blocks in the morning and blocks in the night. Everything around him fit into a nice little square. Even though most people didn't realize it, the blocks of the air were actually blocks that you could move through seamlessly. The whole world was one giant cube full of air and dirt and coal and ores and water and creatures. And even those creatures conformed to a certain size. Even they were part of the block world. Steve used to get up really early in the morning and make his way down to the breakfast table. The breakfast table was made up of a piece of fence and a pressure plate, so it always did this weird clicky thing when you sat down next to it in the staircase that had been repurposed as a chair. But he would put his square bowl made of wood onto that table, and he would enjoy the fact that his breakfast came out in block shapes. Little pixelated eggs turned into squares with square yolks. Little square pieces of bacon that came from the square pigs. His world was what he knew. And if you ever thought that you could show Steve a circle and blow his mind in the same way that the early explorers had their mind blown by the idea that the world was round and that you could travel around it in a boat, Steve would be utterly confused. Steve today had a lot of things to do in his agenda. He knew that he needed to take the ores that he had mined up, convert them into other things, and advance himself in life. And one of the first things that he wanted to do was experiment with some animal husbandry. See, when Steve was only 7 years old, his school took him on a field trip to Blocky Farms. And at Blocky Farms, he had his first encounter with cows and pigs and horses and all kinds of other beautiful animals that sometimes he would ride, sometimes he would eat. But he gave himself an understanding of what nature was actually like. He actually put himself in touch with the surroundings that he found himself in adulthood. And as he grew older, he discovered new ways to use these animals. He found ways to cut them up into steaks and skin them for leather. And he did this all in a very straightforward process with his little pixelated sword, cutting away at them, turning them into useful things. But on this trip down to Blocky Farms, he got to try a lot of different things. He sheared a sheep for the first time in order to get its precious wool. He hatched some eggs and got little chicks out of them with giant heads and small flapping bodies. He learned how to hem in the animals in their own little pens and put them in a place that he could access easily. He also learned that some of these animals appealed to different purposes and were attracted by different things. Some of the animals were drawn by wheat seeds, and other animals were drawn by pieces of wheat. Some of these animals had to be tamed with carrots or potatoes or other hard to find animals, or other hard to find fruits, and some of them were just satisfied with having meat. And while he was at the farm, the things he learned about weren't just limited to animals. He also learned about the growth of plants and the cycle of life that plants go through. See, Steve looked up at the sun, its giant square on the side, its life-giving light that helped plants grow, kept mobs away, kept him alive. And he learned about the cycle. And what is that cycle, you may wonder? Well, the cycle in his world is that the sun casts its rays down upon... I'm sorry, guys. I'm completely distracted by the hemming and hawing of the villagers. It is hilarious, and at some point we'll need to take a little detour to talk about how the language of the villagers evolved and where that came from. It's actually a derivative of Sanskrit. And their spoken word is got a rich oral tradition that they've used to carry down their history because they haven't yet evolved to the point where they have their own writing. But back to the cycle of life that Steve was able to witness on his trip to the farm. See, in life, everything starts with the sun. Our planet, its cube shape floating through the sky, it wouldn't be possible without the sun, because the sun does something very important. It gives off light, and that light contains energy. It is energy, and it travels very fast, the fastest thing in the universe, all the way down to the world of Minecraft. And light coming from the sun is converted into food by plants. They have this amazing property called photosynthesis, and they have these cells in their bodies that are called chloroplasts that absorb the sunlight and convert those packets of energy into usable food. And the interesting thing is, through the process of photosynthesis, where they turn the light energy into food, they give off some interesting byproducts. And those byproducts include oxygen. And it's because of the output of oxygen that we're able to breathe on this earth. If it wasn't for the plants, if all the plants disappeared tomorrow, we wouldn't have enough oxygen to be able to breathe and wander around on the earth. So photosynthesis is important, and it's possible because of chloroplasts and oxidative phosphorylation and the other processes. And Steve learned about all these things on his trip. And what he learned was that the plants take in the sunlight, they get some nutrients from the dirt, they get some nutrients from the water, they produce oxygen, they produce their stalks and their flowers and the fruits of the trees, and those things feed animals. Animals can come along and eat the wheat, and if they're lower down on the food chain, which plants are at the bottom of, they can then be eaten by bigger animals. In the Minecraft world, there isn't a lot of animal-on-animal consumption, but Steve gets to benefit from the products of all the animals. And so he learned about how the horses can eat the carrots, and how the cows can eat the wheat, and how the ducks can eat the seeds. And the ducks can then be chopped up and turned into raw chicken. I guess it actually is a chicken. There's no real thing as a duck in this game. But the ducks can be turned into raw chicken. And those raw chickens can then be cooked and eaten by Steve. And Steve will eat these things and be nourished, and they will cure his hunger. And then a zombie can eat Steve, because really in this game the zombie is the top of the food chain. But what happens is, eventually, that zombie will be caught in the sunlight, he will burn up, and he'll turn into dirt. And from that dirt, new grass seeds will be planted, and then they will grow their own stalks of wheat, and then those stalks of wheat will be turned into food for the cows, and the cows will be turned into steaks, and Steve will feed again, and that is the cycle. It's almost as if the sun is an undifferentiated observer. The sun looks down upon the world of Minecraft from far away and bestows upon it the energy and the strength to be able to grow and be strong and have fruitful production. It's an amazing thing. I think in the next episode we'll talk about the moon. But let's get back to the story at hand. Steve, having visited the villagers, introduced himself and made friends with a few of them, he even went as far as having early conversations and the trading of wheat into emeralds, and tried to figure out what he might use an emerald for. He wasn't quite sure yet. But now that he had met them, he returned to his home and decided to do a little bit of cleaning and organization. See, Steve had a second floor in his house now, and that pretty much served as the attic. And if attics are used for anything, they're used for storage. And in order to store things in a nice and organized way, you can't just throw them out into the floor or down a shaft. You have to have yourself a chest. And Steve had two. And through the magic of block assimilation, Steve was able to merge the two blocks of chest shape into one nice large block, which actually doubled the size of what was available to him. And now that his chest was up and he had gotten rid of some of the things he didn't need, he set out on his next project. Steve, knowing a lot about the cycle of animals and life, and knowing something about how animals lived and what kind of things they needed, Steve decided he was going to build himself a nice little fence. And inside that fence, he was going to put some animals. And he was going to feed those animals and take care of them. He was going to make little animals, and he was going to make those little animals big, and he was going to eat those animals. And so what he had to do was go out and adventure outside his home and go into the forest, because the forest needed a little bit of trimming. He needed to get some wood together so that he could build the fences he needed, and then he would be able to build his farm. So Steve went out, and peering around the forest edge, he spied some skeletons and an Enderman wandering about despite the fact that it was daytime. He worried a little bit about whether or not he would be able to make it through till the next day with so many dangers at the side, but he knew also that the sun in all its glory would actually shine down rays of devastation and destruction upon those Endermen and those skeletons, those creepers that be creeping, and those zombies that be haunting. And he went back to his work. He started to chop away again, chopping away not only at the wood, but also at the trees themselves, because the trees had leaves, and the leaves hid the saplings that he needed to keep his farm sustainable. So Steve, in gathering the wood, would finish off the actual trunks of the trees and then go and try to knock some of those saplings down. And knowing that after time the trees themselves would decay and turn into nothingness except for blocks of air where there once was blocks of leaves, Steve knew that he could return, find despawned and fallen saplings of the Acacia tree. Steve. Oh, Steve. You are amazing, Steve. Sometimes this narrator just gets lost in the wonder of watching him discover his world. Steve replanted the forest because Steve was just that kind of guy. He didn't want to do all the deforestation. He wanted his forest to be completely sustainable. He wanted his trees to grow thick and strong and be present next to one another. And Steve made great effort to do that. And once he was done with building the trees, he went out to build himself his own farm. His days visiting Blocky Farm flooded back to his mind as he started to put up the first fence posts for his own farm. He knew that his farm would have to be nice and secure, and that he'd have to have lots of gates both in the front and the back and the sides and between the two pens, because he knew that the animals would not be able to get through those gates, but he would, and he had to get in there regularly to feed the animals and make sure that they were safe. Every once in a while, the world that Steve was in would generate really weird and random sounds that were kind of scary, and Steve, not knowing exactly how to respond to them, would flounder and look about. He realized very quickly that the amount of wood required to build a fence is kind of ridiculous, and that he would have to chop down many, many more trees in order to get the required supplies for building enough fences. So he set out to do that, getting out his trusty axe, which was on its last legs and probably going to break in this next round. He started to cut away the trees, make them fall to pieces. Steve had a sister who lived in Rhode Island, or at least the Minecraft blocky version of Rhode Island, and he thought to himself, man, I really need to call my sister. It's been way too long. I'm out here just cutting away wood, and at some point I need to get in contact with my family. But the reality is, it's kind of hard for Steve to get in contact with his family since he's living in a pretty primitive world. He hasn't had the blocks mined up to make the silicon that goes into the chip, that goes into his phone, or the metal that he needs to build a full antenna so he could get good cell phone service. Right now, Steve definitely had 0 bars, and it was going to be hard to fix that. But in the meantime, he had plenty of work. He was going to turn all of the blocks that he had pulled out of the tree into little planks, and then the planks he would turn into sticks. And once he figured out how to make the sticks, he was going to make more fences. And then he was going to go back outside, and he was going to finish that fence. Steve was getting pretty good at working with his hands. He didn't remember exactly how to build everything. Every once in a while, he would have to go back and look at the instructions, but that's the life of a block man like Steve. He's got to figure things out on his own. Everything isn't going to be presented to him in a nice way. He's going to have to do things and be a man. And that's what Steve was. He was a block man. He was a strong man, and he was going to figure things out. Having recently finished the last bits of the fence that he needed to make, and having 40 nice pieces of fence, Steve ventured back outside to build up the rest of his pen. Putting in block by block, he was measuring out the sides of the fence that he was creating so that he knew that what he was making was going to link up nicely. It was going to be able to store the animals that he needed to and provide him with sustenance evermore. And once that first part of the fence was done, Steve went out and built the second half of this fence. The second block is where the chickens, the ducks would be hiding. And at some point, realizing that this version of the game had horses in it, he would have to expand this whole area, build some stables so he could house his horses and feed them carrots. And then running home, he put his stake in the ground and saw in the distance a burning zombie who he would put out of his misery and collect all those delicious XPs and the rotten meat to feed to the dogs, which he had yet to encounter. But before he went inside, he met a dancing cow, and this dancing cow thought that he knew how to serve Steve. But Steve knew how to serve him a little bit better. And he knocked him back into his pen and said, "Cow, you just been served." And so the cow was served. And from now on would have to serve Steve. Steve ventured back to his forest in an attempt to replant it with the saplings that he had gathered up off the ground. And in the meantime, found himself in possession of more saplings than he had ever hoped to have, and more wood than he had expected to get. Bits and pieces of wood were left behind the day before. Steve wandered about his open copse of trees, trying to find the right place to put those saplings, because he wanted this little forest to be absolutely perfect. He wanted it to grow and flourish and be plentiful for him every time he ventured out of the home. Steve cleared grass and collected seeds, hopped over his little cave system, and went home to check the time, because he felt that he was actually coming close to the end of his day. His trials and tribulations were almost over. But there were a few things to take care of before he finished the day. He was going to need to eat some food. He was going to need to cook some sand, because the next time that he met with his rabid fans, he was going to put some windows up. There's a lot to do in the world of Steve. There's a lot to explore, and there's a lot of amazing things to learn about. In our next episode, we're going to have some more insights into the origins of Steve, where he came from, what his family is like, what his hobbies and profession is like, and we're going to do some more building and crafting. So please leave a like rating, subscribe if you enjoyed this, and we'll see you next time on the Narrative Minecraft. Thanks.